A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. Recording by David Mack. Poltarnes, Beholder of Ocean. Chapter 1 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. Toldes, Mondath, Arizim. These are the inner lands, the lands whose sentinels upon their borders do not behold the sea. Beyond them to the east there lies a desert, forever untroubled by man. All yellow it is, and spotted with shadows of stones, and death is in it, lying like a leopard in the sun. To the south they are bounded by magic, to the west by a mountain, and to the north by the voice and anger of the polar wind. Like a great wall is the mountain to the west. It comes up out of the distance and goes down into the distance again, and it is named Poltarnes, Beholder of Ocean. To the northward red rocks, smooth and bare of soil, and without any speck of moss or herbage, slope up to the very lips of the polar wind, and there is nothing else there by the noise of his anger. Very peaceful are the inner lands, and very fair are their cities, and there is no war among them, but quiet and ease. And they have no enemy but age, for thirst and fever lie sunning themselves out in the mid-desert, and never prowl into the inner lands. And the ghouls and ghosts, whose highway is the night, are kept in the south by the boundary of magic. And very small are all their pleasant cities, and all men are known to one another therein, and bless one another by name as they meet in the streets. And they have a broad green way in every city that comes in out of some vale or wood or downland, and wanders in and out about the city between the houses and across the streets. And the people walk along it never at all, but every year at her appointed time, spring walks along it from the flowery lands, causing the anemone to bloom on the green way, and all the early joys of hidden woods, or deep secluded vales, or triumphant downlands, whose heads lift up so proudly, far up aloof from cities. Sometimes wagoners or shepherds walk along this way, they that have come into the city from over cloudy ridges, and the townsmen hinder them not, for there is a tread that troubleth the grass, and a tread that troubleth it not, and each man in his own heart knoweth which tread he hath. And in the sunlit spaces of the weald, and in the wold's dark places, afar from the music of cities, and from the dance of the cities afar, they make there the music of the country places, and dance the country dance. Amiable, near, and friendly appears to these men the sun, and he is as genial to them, and tends their younger vines, so they are kind to the little woodland things, and any rumor of the fairies or old legend. And when the light of some little distant city makes a slight flush upon the edge of the sky, and the happy golden windows of the homestead stare gleaming into the dark, then the old and holy figure of romance, cloaked even to the face, comes down out of hilly woodlands and bids dark shadows to rise and dance, and sends the forest creatures forth to prowl, and lights in a moment in her bower of grass the little glowworm's lamp, and brings a hush down over the gray lands, and out of it rises faintly on far-off hills the voice of a lute. There are not in the world lands more prosperous and happy than Toldes, Mondath, Arizim. From these three little kingdoms that are named the inner lands, the young men stole constantly away. One by one they went, and no one knew why they went, save that they had a longing to behold the sea. Of this longing they spoke little, but a young man would become silent for a few days, and then, one morning very early, he would slip away and slowly climb Poltarnes' difficult slope, and having attained the top, pass over and never return. A few stayed behind in the inner lands and became the old men, but none that had ever climbed Poltarnes from the very earliest times had ever come back again. Many had gone up Poltarnes sworn to return. Once a king sent all his courtiers one by one to report the mystery to him, and then went himself. None ever returned. Now it was the wont of the folk of the inner lands to worship rumors and legends of the sea, and all that their prophets discovered of the sea was writ in a sacred book, and with deep devotion on days of festival or mourning read in the temples by the priests. Now all their temples lay open to the west, resting upon pillars, that the breeze from the sea might enter them, and they lay open on pillars to the east, that the breezes of the sea might not be hindered by pass onward wherever the sea lists. And this is the legend that they had of the sea, whom none in the inner lands had ever beholden. They say that the sea is a river heading towards Hercules, and they say that he touches against the edge of the world and that Poltarnes looks upon him. They say that all the worlds of heaven go bobbing on this river and are swept down with the stream, and that infinity is thick and furry with forests through which the river in his course sweeps on with all the worlds of heaven. Among the colossal trunks of those dark trees, the smallest fronds of whose branches are man-nights, there walk the gods. And whenever its thirst, glowing in space like a great sun, comes upon the beast, the tiger of the gods creeps down to the river to drink, and the tiger of the gods drinks his fill loudly, whelming worlds the while, and the level of the river sinks between its banks ere the beast's thirst is quenched and ceases to glow like a sun. And many worlds thereby are heaped up, dry and stranded, and the gods walk not among them evermore, because they are hard to their feet. These are the worlds that have no destiny, whose people know no God, and the river sweeps onwards ever. And the name of the river is Oriathon, but men call it Ocean. This is the lower faith of the inner lands, and there is a higher faith which is not told to all. Oriathon sweeps on through the forests of infinity, and all at once falls roaring over an edge, whence time has long ago recalled his hours to fight in his war with the gods, and falls unlit by the flash of nights and days, with his flood unmeasured by miles, into the deeps of nothing. Now as the centuries went by, and the one way by which a man could climb Poltarnes became worn with feet, more and more men surmounted it, not to return. And still they knew not in the inner lands upon what mystery Poltarnes looked. For on a still day and windless, while men walked happily about their beautiful streets or tended flocks in the country, suddenly the west wind would bestir himself and come in from the sea, and he would come cloaked and grey and mournful, and carry to someone the hungry cry of the sea calling out for bones of men. And he that heard it would move restlessly for some hours, and at last would rise suddenly, irresistibly up, setting his face to Poltarnes, and would say, as is the custom of those lands when men part briefly, till a man's heart remembereth, which means farewell for a while. But those that loved him, seeing his eyes on Poltarnes, would answer sadly, till the gods forget, which means farewell. Now the king of Arizim had a daughter who played with the wild wood flowers and with the fountains in her father's court, and with the little blue heaven birds that came to her doorway in the winter to shelter from the snow. And she was more beautiful than the wild wood flowers, or than all the fountains in her father's court, or than the blue heaven birds in their full winter plumage when they shelter from the snow. The old wise kings of Mondoth and of Toldes saw her once as she went lightly down the little paths of her garden, and turning their gaze into the mists of thought, pondered the destiny of their inner lands. And they watched her closely by the stately flowers, and standing alone in the sunlight, and passing and repassing the strutting purple birds that the king's fowlers had brought from Asagaon. When she was of the age of 15 years, the king of Mondoth called a council of kings, and there met with him the kings of Toldes and Arizim. And the king of Mondoth and his council said, "The call of the unappeased and hungry sea," and at the word sea the three kings bowed their heads, "lures every year out of our happy kingdoms more and more of our men, and still we know not the mystery of the sea, and no devised oath has brought one man back. Now thy daughter, Arizim, is lovelier than the sunlight, and lovelier than those stately flowers of thine that stand so tall in her garden, and hath more grace and beauty than those strange birds that the venturous fowlers bring in creaking wagons out of a Sagaeon, whose feathers are alternate purple and white. Now he that shall love thy daughter Hilnaric, whoever he shall be, is the man to climb Poltarnes and return, as none hath ever before, and tell us upon what Poltarnes looks, for it may be that thy daughter is more beautiful than the sea. Then from his seat of council arose the king of Arizim. He said, I fear that thou hast spoken blasphemy against the sea, and I have a dread that ill will come of it. Indeed, I had not thought she was so fair. It is such a short while ago that she was quite a small child, with her hair still unkempt and not yet attired in the manner of princesses, and she would go up into the wild woods unattended, and come back with her robes unseemly and all torn, and would not take reproof with a humble spirit, but made grimaces even in my marble court, all set about with fountains. Then said the king of Toldes, Let us watch more closely, and let us see the Princess Hilnaric in the season of the orchard bloom, when the great birds go by that know the sea, to rest in our inland places. And if she be more beautiful than the sunrise over our folded kingdoms when all the orchards bloom, it may be that she is more beautiful than the sea. And the king of Arizim said, I fear this is terrible blasphemy, yet will I do as you have decided in council. And the season of the orchard bloom appeared. One night the king of Arizim called his daughter forth on his outer balcony of marble, and the moon was rising huge and round and holy over dark woods, and all the fountains were singing to the night. And the moon touched the marble palace gables, and they glowed in the land. And the moon touched the heads of all the fountains, and the great columns broke into fairy lights. And the moon left the dark ways of the forest, and lit the whole white palace and its fountains, and shone on the forehead of the princess. And the palace of Arizim glowed afar, and the fountains became columns of gleaming jewels and song. And the moon made a music at its rising, but it fell a little short of mortal ears. And Hilnaric stood there wondering, clad in white, with the moonlight shining on her forehead. And watching her from the shadows on the terrace stood the kings of Mondoth and Toldes. They said, She is more beautiful than the moonrise. And on another day the king of Arizim bade his daughter forth at dawn, and they stood again upon the balcony. And the sun came up over a world of orchards, and the sea mists went back over Poltarnes to the sea. Little wild voices arose in all the thickets. The voices of the fountains began to die, and the song arose in all the marble temples of the birds that are sacred to the sea. And Hilnaric stood there, still glowing with dreams of heaven. She is more beautiful, said the kings, than morning. Yet one more trial they made of Hilnaric's beauty, for they watched her on the terraces at sunset ere yet the petals of the orchards had fallen, and all along the edge of neighboring woods the rhododendron was blooming with the azalea. And the sun went down under craggy Poltarnes, and the sea mist poured over his summit inland. And the marble temples stood up clear in the evening, but films of twilight were drawn between the mountains and the city. Then from the temple ledges and eaves of palaces the bats fell headlong downwards, then spread their wings and floated up and down through darkening ways. Lights came blinking out in golden windows. Men cloaked themselves against the grey sea mist. The sound of small songs arose, and the face of Hilnaric became a resting place for mysteries and dreams. Then all these things, said the kings, she is more lovely, but who can say whether she is lovelier than the sea? Prone in a rhododendron thicket at the edge of the palace lawns, a hunter had waited since the sun went down. Near to him was a deep pool where the hyacinths grew and strange flowers floated upon it with broad leaves. And there the great bull Garyax came down to drink by starlight. And waiting there for the Garyax to come, he saw the white form of the princess leaning on her balcony. Before the stars shone out or the bulls came down to drink, he left his lurking place and moved closer to the palace to see more nearly the princess. The palace lawns were full of untrodden dew, and everything was still when he came across them holding his great spear. In the farthest corner of the terraces, the three old kings were discussing the beauty of Hilnaric and the destiny of the inner lands. Moving lightly with a hunter's tread, the watcher by the pool came very near, even in the still evening, before the princess saw him. When he saw her closely, he exclaimed suddenly, "She must be more beautiful than the sea." When the princess turned and saw his garb and his great spear, she knew that he was a hunter of Garayax. When the three kings heard the young man exclaim, they said softly to one another, "This must be the man." Then they revealed themselves to him and spoke to him to try him. They said, "Sir, you have spoken blasphemy against the sea." And the young man muttered, "She is more beautiful than the sea." And the kings said, "We are older than you and wiser, and know that nothing is more beautiful than the sea." And the young man took off the gear of his head and became downcast. And he knew that he spake with kings, yet he answered, "By this spear she is more beautiful than the sea." And all the while the princess stared at him, knowing him to be a hunter of Garayax. Then the king of Arizim said to the watcher by the pool, "If thou wilt go up Poltarnes and come back, as none have come, and report to us what lure or magic is in the sea, we will pardon thy blasphemy, and thou shalt have the princess to wife, and sit among the council of kings." And gladly thereunto the young man consented. And the princess spoke to him, and asked him his name. And he told her that his name was Ethelvak, and great joy arose in him at the sound of her voice. And to the three kings he promised to set out on the third day to scale the slope of Poltarnes and to return again, and this was the oath by which they bound him to return. "I swear by the sea that bears the worlds away, by the river Ovariathon, which men call ocean, and by the gods and their tiger, and by the doom of the worlds, that I will return again to the inner lands, having beheld the sea." And that oath he swore with solemnity that very night in one of the temples of the sea. But the three kings trusted more to the beauty of Hilnaric, even than to the power of the oath. The next day Ethelvak came to the palace of Arizim with the morning, over the fields to the east and out of the country of Toldes. And Hilnaric came out along her balcony and met him on the terraces. And she asked him if he had ever slain a Garayak, and he said that he had slain 3. And then he told her how he had killed his first down by the pool in the wood. For he had taken his father's spear and gone down to the edge of the pool, and had lain under the azaleas there waiting for the stars to shine, by whose first light the Garayaks go to the pools to drink. And he had gone too early, and had had long to wait, and the passing hours seemed longer than they were. And all the birds came in that home at night, and the bat was abroad, and the hour of the duck went by, and still no Garayak came down to the pool, and Ethelvak felt sure that none would come. And just as this grew to a certainty in his mind, the thicket parted noiselessly, and a huge bull Garayak stood facing him on the edge of the water, and his great horns swept out sideways from his head, and at the ends curved upwards, and were 4 strides in width from tip to tip. And he had not seen Ethelvak, for the great bull was on the far side of the little pool, and Ethelvak could not creep round to him for fear of meeting the wind, for the Garayaks, who can see little in the dark forests, rely on hearing and smell. But he devised swiftly in his mind while the bull stood there with head erect just 20 strides from him across the water. And the bull sniffed the wind cautiously and listened, then lowered his great head down to the pool and drank. At that instant Ethelvak leapt into the water and shot forward through its weedy depths among the stems of the strange flowers that floated upon broad leaves on the surface. And Ethelvak kept his spear out straight before him, and the fingers of his left hand he held rigid and straight, not pointing upwards, and so did not come to the surface, but was carried onward by the strength of his spring, and passed unentangled through the stems of the flowers. When a Thelvok jumped into the water, the bull must have thrown his head up, startled at the splash. Then he would have listened and have sniffed the air, and neither hearing nor scenting any danger, he must have remained rigid for some moments. For it was in that attitude that a Thelvok found him as he emerged breathless at his feet. And striking at once, a Thelvok drove the spear into his throat before the head and the terrible horns came down. But a Thelvok had clung to one of the great horns, and had been carried at terrible speed through the rhododendron bushes until the Goriac fell, but rose at once again and died standing up, still struggling, drowned in its own blood. But to Hilnaric listening, it was as though one of the heroes of old time had come back again in the full glory of his legendary youth. And long time they went up and down the terraces, saying those things which were said before and since, and which lips shall yet be made to say again. And above them stood Poltarnes, beholding the sea. And the day came when a Thelvok should go, and Hilnaric said to him, "Will you not indeed most surely come back again, having just looked over the summit of Poltarnes?" A Thelvok answered, "I will indeed come back, for thy voice is more beautiful than the hymn of the priests when they chant and praise the sea. And though many tributary seas run down into Ariathan, and he and all the others poured their beauty into one pool below me, yet would I return swearing that thou wert fairer than they." And Hilnaric answered, "The wisdom of my heart tells me, or old knowledge or prophecy or some strange lore, that I shall never hear thy voice again, and for this I give thee my forgiveness." But he, repeating the oath that he had sworn, set out, looking often backwards until the slope became to step, and his face was set to the rock. It was in the morning that he had started, and he climbed all the day with little rest, where every foothold was smooth with many feet. Before he reached the top, the sun disappeared from him, and darker grew the inner lands. Then he pushed on so as to see before dark whatever thing Poltarnes had to show. The dusk was deep over the inner lands, and the lights of cities twinkled through the sea mist when he came to Poltarnes' summit, and the sun before him was not yet gone from the sky. And there, below him, was the old wrinkled sea, smiling and murmuring song. And he nursed little ships with gleaming sails, and in his hands were old regretted wrecks and masts all studded over with golden nails that he had rent in anger out of beautiful galleons. And the glory of the sun was among the surges as they brought driftwood out of isles of spice, tossing their golden heads. And the grey currents crept away to the south like companionless serpents that love something afar with a restless, deadly love. And the whole plain of water glittering with late sunlight, and the surges and the currents and the white sails of ships were all together like the face of a strange new god that has looked at a man for the first time in the eyes at the moment of his death. And a Thelvok, looking on the wonderful sea, knew why it was that the dead never return. For there is something that the dead feel and know, and the living would never understand, even though the dead should come and speak to them about it. And there was the sea smiling at him, glad with the glory of the sun. And there was a haven there for homing ships, and a sunlit city stood upon its marge, and people walked about the streets of it clad in the unimagined merchandise of far sea-bordering lands. An easy slope of loose rock went from the top of Poltarnes to the shore of the sea. For a long while a Thelvok stood there, regretfully, knowing that there had come something into his soul that no one in the inner lands could understand, where the thoughts of their minds had gone no farther than the 3 little kingdoms. Then, looking long upon the wandering ships, and the marvelous merchandise from alien lands, and the unknown color that wreathed the brows of the sea, he turned his face to the darkness and the inner lands. At that moment, the sea sang a dirge at sunset for all the harm that he had done in anger and all the ruin wrought on adventurous ships, and there were tears in the voice of the tyrannous sea, for he had loved the galleons that he had overwhelmed, And he called all men to him, and all living things, that he might make amends, because he had loved the bones that he had strewn afar. And Ethelwalch turned, and set one foot upon the crumbled slope, and then another, and walked a little way to be nearer to the sea. And then a dream came upon him, and he felt that men had wronged the lovely sea, because he had been angry a little, because he had been sometimes cruel. He felt there was trouble among the tides of the sea, because he had loved the galleons who were dead. Still he walked on, and the crumbled stones rolled with him. And just as the twilight faded, and a star appeared, he came to the golden shore, and walked on till the surges were about his knees, and he heard the prayer-like blessings of the sea. Long he stood thus, while the stars came out above him and shone again in the surges. More stars came wheeling in their courses up from the sea. Lights twinkled out through all the haven city. Lanterns were slung from the ships. The purple night burned on. And earth, to the eyes of the gods as they sat afar, glowed as with one flame. Then Ethelwalch went into the haven city. There he met many people who had left the inner lands before him. None of them wished to return to the people who had not seen the sea. Many of them had forgotten the three little kingdoms, and it was rumored that one man, who had once tried to return, had found the shifting, crumbled slope impossible to climb. Hilnaric never married, but her dowry was set aside to build a temple wherein men curse the ocean. Once every year, with solemn rite and ceremony, they curse the tides of the sea, and the moon looks in and hates them. End of Poltarni's Beholder of Ocean, Chapter 1 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. Blagdaross, Chapter 2 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. On a waste place, strewn with bricks in the outskirts of a town, twilight was falling. A star or two appeared over the smoke, and distant windows lit mysterious lights. The stillness deepened and the loneliness. Then, all the outcast things that are silent by day found voices. An old cork spoke first. He said, "I grew in Andalusian woods, but never listened to the idle songs of Spain. I only grew strong in the sunlight, waiting for my destiny. One day the merchants came and took us all away and carried us all along the shore of the sea, piled high in the backs of donkeys. And in a town by the sea, they made me into the shape that I am now. One day they sent me northward to Provence, and there I fulfilled my destiny, for they set me as a guard over the bubbling wine, and I faithfully stood sentinel for 20 years. For the first few years in the bottle that I guarded, the wine slept, dreaming of Provence. But as the years went on, he grew stronger and stronger, until at last, whenever a man went by, the wind would put out all his might against me, saying, 'Let me go free! Let me go free!' And every year his strength increased, and he grew more clamorous when men went by, but never availed to hurl me from my post. But when I had powerfully held him for 20 years, they brought him to the banquet, and took me from my post. And the wine arose rejoicing, and leapt through the veins of men, and exalted their souls within them, till they stood up in their places, and sang Provençal songs. But me they cast away, me that had been sentinel for 20 years, and was still as strong and staunch as when I first went on guard. Now I am an outcast in a cold northern city, who once had known the Andalusian skies, and guarded long ago Provençal suns that swam in the heart of the rejoicing wine." An unstruck match that somebody had dropped spoke next. "I am a child of the sun," he said, "and an enemy of cities. There is more in my heart than you know of. I am a brother of Etna and Stromboli. I have fires lurking in me that will one day rise up beautiful and strong. We will not go into servitude on any hearth, nor work machines for our food, but we will take our own food where we find it on that day when we are strong. There are wonderful children in my heart, whose faces shall be more lively than the rainbow. They shall make a compact with the north wind, and he shall lead them forth. All shall be black behind them, and black above them, and there shall be nothing beautiful in the world but them. They shall seize upon the earth, and it shall be theirs, and nothing shall stop them but our old enemy, the sea. Then an old broken kettle spoke, and said, I am the friend of cities. I sit among the slaves upon the hearth, the little flames that have been fed with coal. When the slaves dance behind the iron bars, I sit in the middle of the dance and sing and make our masters glad. And I make songs about the comfort of the cat, and about the malice that is towards her in the heart of the dog, and about the crawling of the baby, and about the ease that is in the lord of the house when we brew the good brown tea. And sometimes when the house is very warm, and the slaves and masters are glad, I rebuke the hostile winds that prowl about the world. And then there spoke the piece of an old chord. I was made in a place of doom, and doomed men made my fibers, working without hope. Therefore there came a grimness into my heart, so that I never let anything go free when once I was set to bind it. Many a thing have I bound relentlessly for months and years, for I used to come coiling into warehouses where the great boxes lay all open to the air, and one of them would be suddenly closed up, and my fearful strength would be set on him like a curse. And if his timbers groaned when first I seized them, or if they creaked aloud in the lonely night, thinking of woodlands out of which they came, then I only gripped them tighter still, for the poor useless hate is in my soul of those that made me in the place of doom. Yet for all the things that my prison clutch has held, the last work that I did was to set something free. I lay idle one night in the gloom on the warehouse floor. Nothing stirred there, and even the spider slept. Towards midnight, a great flock of echoes suddenly leapt up from the wooden planks and circled round the roof. A man was coming towards me all alone, and as he came his soul was reproaching him, and I saw that there was a great trouble between the man and his soul, for his soul would not let him be, but went on reproaching him. Then the man saw me, and said, This, at least, will not fail me. When I heard him say this about me, I determined that whatever he might require of me, it should be done to the uttermost. And as I made this determination in my unfaltering heart, he picked me up and stood on an empty box that I should have bound on the morrow, and tied one end of me to a dark rafter. And the knot was carelessly tied, because his soul was reproaching him all the while continually, and giving him no ease. Then he made the other end of me into a noose. But when the man's soul saw this, it stopped reproaching the man, and cried out to him hurriedly, and besought him to be at peace with it, and to do nothing sudden. But the man went on with his work, and put the noose down over his face and underneath his chin, and the soul screamed horribly. Then the man kicked the box away with his foot, and the moment he did this I knew that my strength was not great enough to hold him, but I remembered that he had said I would not fail him, and I put all my grim vigor into my fibers and held by sheer will. Then the soul shouted to me to give way, but I said, No, you vexed the man. Then it screamed for me to leave go of the rafter, but already I was slipping, for I only held on to it by a careless knot. But I gripped with my prison grip and said, You vexed the man. And very swiftly it said other things to me, but I answered not. And at last the soul that vexed the man that had trusted me flew away and left him at peace. I was never able to bind things any more, for every one of my fibers was worn and wrenched, and even my relentless heart was weakened by the struggle. Very soon afterwards I was thrown out here. I have done my work. So they spoke among themselves, but all the while there loomed above them the form of an old rocking horse complaining bitterly. He said, I am Blagdaross. Woe is me that I should lie now an outcast among these worthy but little people. Alas for the days that are gathered, and alas for the great one that was a master and a soul to me, whose spirit is now shrunken and can never know me again, and no more ride abroad on nightly quests. I was Bucephalus when he was Alexander, and carried him victorious as far as India. I encountered dragons with him when he was St. George. I was the horse of Roland fighting for Christendom, and was often Rosinante. I fought in tourneys, and went errant upon quests, and met Ulysses and the heroes and the fairies. Or late in the evening, just before the lamps in the nurseries were put out, he would suddenly mount me, and we would gallop through Africa. There we would pass by night through tropic forests, and come upon dark rivers sweeping by, all gleaming with the eyes of crocodiles, where the hippopotamus floated down with the stream, and mysterious craft loomed suddenly out of the dark and furtively passed away. And when we had passed through the forest lit by the fireflies, we would come to the open plains, and gallop onwards with scarlet flamingos flying along beside us through the land of dusky kings, with golden crowns upon their heads and scepters in their hands, who came running out of their palaces to see us pass. Then I would wheel suddenly, and the dust flew up from my 4 hooves as I turned, and we galloped home again, and my master was put to bed. And again we would ride abroad on another day, till we came to magical fortresses guarded by wizardry, and overthrew the dragons at the gate, and ever came back with a princess fairer than the sea. But my master began to grow larger in his body and smaller in his soul, and then he rode more seldom upon quests. At last he saw gold, and never came again, and I was cast out here among these little people. But while the rocking horse was speaking, 2 boys stole away, unnoticed by their parents, from a house on the edge of the waste place, and were coming across it looking for adventures. One of them carried a broom, and when he saw the rocking horse he said nothing, but broke off the handle from the broom and thrust it between his braces and his shirt on the left side. Then he mounted the rocking horse, and drawing forth the broomstick, which was sharp and spiky at the end, said, "Saladin is in this desert with all his paynims, and I am Coeur de Lion." And after a while the other boy said, "Now let me kill Saladin too." But Blagdaross, in his wooden heart that exulted with thoughts of battle, said, "I am Blagdaross yet." End of Blagdaross. Chapter 2 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. The Madness of Andelsproets. Chapter 3 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. I first saw the city of Andelsproets on an afternoon in spring. The day was full of sunshine as I came by the way of the fields, and all that morning I had said, "There will be sunlight on it when I see for the first time the beautiful conquered city, whose fame has so often made for me lovely dreams." Suddenly I saw its fortifications lifting out of the fields, and behind them stood its belfries. I went in by a gate and saw its houses and streets, and a great disappointment came upon me. For there is an air about a city, and it has a way with it whereby a man may recognize one from another at once. There are cities full of happiness, and cities full of pleasure, and cities full of gloom. There are cities with faces to heaven, and some with their faces to earth. Some have a way of looking at the past, and others look at the future. Some notice you if you come among them, others glance at you, others let you go by. Some love the cities that are their neighbors, others are dear to the plains and to the heath. Some cities are bare to the wind, others have purple cloaks and others brown cloaks, and some are clad in white. Some tell the old tale of their infancy, with others it is secret. Some cities sing and some mutter, some are angry and some have broken hearts, and each city has her way of greeting time. I had said, I will see Andalsbruce arrogant with her beauty, and I had said, I will see her weeping over her conquest. I had said, she will sing songs to me, and she will be reticent. She will be all robed, and she will be bare but splendid. But the windows of Andalsbruce and her houses looked vacantly over the plains like the eyes of a dead madman. At the hour, her chimes sounded unlovely and discordant. Some of them were out of tune, and the bells of some were cracked. Her roofs were bald and without moss. At evening, no pleasant rumor arose in her streets. When the lamps were lit in the houses, no mystical flood of light stole out into the dusk. You merely saw that there were lighted lamps. Andalsbruce had no way with her and no air about her. When the night fell and the blinds were all drawn down, then I perceived what I had not thought in the daylight. I knew then that Andalsbruce was dead. I saw a fair-haired man who drank beer in a cafe, and I said to him, "Why is the city of Andalsbruce quite dead, and her soul gone hence?" He answered, "Cities do not have souls, and there is never any life in bricks." And I said to him, "Sir, you have spoken truly." And I asked the same question of another man, and he gave me the same answer, and I thanked him for his courtesy. And I saw a man of a more slender build, who had black hair and channels in his cheeks for tears to run in. And I said to him, "Why is Andalsbruce quite dead, and when did her soul go hence?" And he answered, "Andalsbruce hoped too much. For 30 years would she stretch out her arms toward the land of Akla every night, to Mother Akla, from whom she had been stolen. Every night she would be hoping and sighing and stretching out her arms to Mother Akla. At midnight, once a year on the anniversary of the terrible day, Akla would send spies to lay a wreath against the walls of Andalsbruce. She could do no more. And on this night, once in every year, I used to weep, for weeping was the mood of the city that nursed me. Every night, while other cities slept, did Andalsbruce sit brooding here and hoping, till 30 wreaths lay mouldering by her walls, and still the armies of Akla could not come. But after she had hoped so long, and on the night that faithful spies had brought her 30th wreath, Andalsbruce went suddenly mad. All the bells clanged hideously in the belfries, horses bolted in the streets, the dogs all howled. The stolid conquerors awoke and turned in their beds and slept again. And I saw the gray shadowy form of Andalsbruce rise up, decking her hair with the phantasms of cathedrals, and stride away from her city. And the great shadowy form that was the soul of Andalsbruce went away muttering to the mountains, and there I followed her, for had she not been my nurse? Yes, I went away alone into the mountains, and for 3 days, wrapped in a cloak, I slept in their misty solitudes. I had no food to eat, and to drink I had only the water of the mountain streams. By day no living thing was near to me, and I heard nothing but the noise of the wind and the mountain streams roaring. But for 3 nights I heard all around me on the mountains the sounds of a great city. I saw the lights of tall cathedral windows flash momentarily on the peaks, and at times the glimmering lantern of some fortress patrol. And I saw the misty outline of the soul of Andalsbruce, sitting decked with her ghostly cathedrals, speaking to herself, with her eyes fixed before her in a mad stare, telling of ancient wars. And her confused speech for all those nights upon the mountain was sometimes the voice of traffic, and then of church bells, and then of bugles, but oftenest it was the voice of red war, and it was all incoherent, and she was quite mad. The 3rd night it rained heavily all night long, but I stayed up there to watch the soul of my native city, and she still sat staring straight before her, raving. But her voice was gentler now. There were more chimes in it, and occasional song. Midnight passed, and the rain still swept down on me, and still the solitudes of the mountain were full of the mutterings of the poor mad city, and the hours after midnight came, the cold hours wherein sick men die. Suddenly I was aware of great shapes moving in the rain, and I heard the sound of voices that were not of my city, nor yet of any that I ever knew. And presently I discerned, though faintly, the souls of a great concourse of cities, all bending over Andalsproots and comforting her. And the ravines of the mountains roared that night with the voices of cities that had lain still for centuries. For there came the soul of Camelot that had so long ago forsaken Usk, and there was Ilion, all girt with towers, still cursing the sweet face of ruinous Helen. I saw there Babylon and Persepolis, and the bearded face of bull-like Nineveh, and Athens, mourning her immortal gods. All these souls of cities that were dead spoke that night on the mountain to my city, and soothed her, until at last she muttered of war no longer, and her eyes stared wildly no more. But she hid her face in her hands, and for some while wept softly. At last she arose, and walking slowly with bended head, and leaning upon Ilion and Carthage, went mournfully eastwards. And the dust of her highways swirled behind her as she went, a ghostly dust that never turned to mud in all that drenching rain. And so the souls of the cities led her away, and gradually they disappeared from the mountain, and the ancient voices died away in the distance. Not since then have I seen my city alive, but once I met with a traveler who said that somewhere in the midst of a great desert are gathered together the souls of all dead cities. He said that he was lost once in a place where there was no water, and he heard their voices speaking all the night. But I said, I was once without water in a desert, and heard a city speaking to me, but knew not whether it really spoke to me or not, for on that day I heard so many terrible things, and only some of them were true. And the man with the black hair said, I believe it to be true, though whither she went I know not. I only know that a shepherd found me in the morning faint with hunger and cold, and carried me down here. And when I came to Andalsproots, it was, as you have perceived it, dead. End of The Madness of Andalsproots. Chapter 3 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. Where the Tides Ebb and Flow. Chapter 4 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. I dreamt that I had done a horrible thing, so that burial was to be denied me either in soil or sea, neither could there be any hell for me. I waited for some hours knowing this. Then my friends came for me, and slew me secretly and with ancient rite, and lit great tapers, and carried me away. It was all in London that the thing was done, and they went furtively at dead of night along grey streets and among mean houses, until they came to the river. And the river and the tide of the sea were grappling with one another between the mudbanks, and both of them were black and full of lights. A sudden wonder came into the eyes of each, as my friends came near to them with their glaring tapers. All these things I saw as they carried me dead and stiffening, for my soul was still among my bones, because there was no hell for it, and because Christian burial was denied me. They took me down a stairway that was green with slimy things, and so came slowly to the terrible mud. There in the territory of forsaken things they dug a shallow grave. When they had finished, they laid me in the grave, and suddenly they cast their tapers to the river. And when the water had quenched the flaring lights, the tapers looked pale and small as they bobbed upon the tide. And at once the glamour of the calamity was gone, and I noticed then the approach of the huge dawn, and my friends cast their cloaks over their faces, and the solemn procession was turned into many fugitives that furtively stole away. Then the mud came back wearily and covered all but my face. There I lay alone with quite forgotten things, with drifting things that the tides will take no farther, with useless things and lost things, and with the horrible, unnatural bricks that are neither stone nor soil. I was rid of feeling, because I had been killed, but perception and thought were in my unhappy soul. The dawn widened, and I saw the desolate houses that crowded the marge of the river, and their dead windows peered into my dead eyes, windows with veils behind them instead of human souls. I grew so weary looking at these forlorn things that I wanted to cry out, but could not because I was dead. Then I knew, as I had never known before, that for all the years that herd of desolate houses had wanted to cry out too, but being dead, were dumb. And I knew then that it had yet been well with the forgotten drifting things if they had wept, but they were eyeless and without life. And I too tried to weep, but there were no tears in my dead eyes. And I knew then that the river might have cared for us, might have caressed us, might have sung to us, but he swept broadly onwards, thinking of nothing but the princely ships. At last the tide did what the river would not, and came and covered me over, and my soul had rest in the green water, and rejoiced and believed that it had the burial of the sea. But with the ebb, the water fell again, and left me alone again with the callous mud among the forgotten things that drift no more, and with the sight of all those desolate houses, and with the knowledge among all of us that each was dead. In the mournful wall behind me, hung with green weeds, forsaken of the sea, dark tunnels appeared, and secret narrow passages that were clamped and barred. From these at last the stealthy rats came down to nibble me away, and my soul rejoiced thereat, and believed that he would be free perforce from the accursed bones to which burial was refused. Very soon the rats ran away a little space and whispered among themselves. They never came any more. When I found that I was accursed even among the rats, I tried to weep again. Then the tide came swinging back and covered the dreadful mud, and hid the desolate houses, and soothed the forgotten things. And my soul had ease for a while in the sepulchre of the sea. And then the tide forsook me again. To and fro it came about me for many years. Then the county council found me, and gave me decent burial. It was the first grave that I had ever slept in. That very night my friends came for me. They dug me up and put me back again in the shallow hold in the mud. Again and again through the years my bones found burial, but always behind the funeral lurked one of those terrible men who, as soon as night fell, came and dug them up and carried them back again to the hole in the mud. And then one day the last of those men died who once had done to me this terrible thing. I heard his soul go over the river at sunset, and again I hoped. A few weeks afterwards I was found once more, and once more taken out of that restless place and given deep burial in sacred ground, where my soul hoped that it should rest. Almost at once men came with cloaks and tapers to give me back to the mud, for the thing had become a tradition and a rite. And all the forsaken things mocked me in their dumb hearts when they saw me carried back, for they were jealous of me because I had left the mud. It must be remembered that I could not weep. And the years went by seawards where the black barges go, and the great derelict centuries became lost at sea, and still I lay there without any cause to hope, and daring not to hope without a cause, because of the terrible envy and the anger of the things that could drift no more. Once a great storm rode up, even as far as London, out of the sea from the south, and he came curving into the river with a fierce east wind, and he was mightier than the dreary tides, and went with great leaps over the listless mud. And all the sad forgotten things rejoiced, and mingled with things that were haughtier than they, and rode once more amongst the lordly shipping that was driven up and down. and out of their hideous home he took my bones. Never again, I hoped, to be vexed with the ebb and flow. And with the fall of the tide he went riding down the river and turned to the southwards, and so went to his home. And my bones he scattered among many isles and along the shores of happy alien mainlands. And for a moment, while they were far asunder, my soul was almost free. Then there arose, at the will of the moon, the assiduous flow of the tide, and it undid at once the work of the ebb, and gathered my bones from the marge of sunny isles, and gleamed them all along the mainland's shores, and went rocking northwards till it came to the mouth of the Thames, and there turned westwards its relentless face, and so went up the river and came to the hole in the mud, and into it dropped my bones, and partly the mud covered them, and partly it left them white, for the mud cares not for its forsaken things. Then the ebb came, and I saw the dead eyes of the houses, and the jealousy of the other forgotten things that the storm had not carried thence. And some more centuries passed over the ebb and flow and over the loneliness of things forgotten, and I lay there all the while in the careless grip of the mud, never wholly covered, yet never able to go free, and I longed for the great caress of the warm earth or for the comfortable lap of the sea. Sometimes men found my bones and buried them, but the tradition never died, and my friend's successors always brought them back. At last the barges went no more, and there were fewer lights. Shaped timbers no longer floated down the fairway, and there came instead old wind-uprooted trees in all their natural simplicity. At last I was aware that somewhere near me a blade of grass was growing, and the moss began to appear all over the dead houses. One day some thistledown went drifting over the river. For some years I watched these signs attentively until I became certain that London was passing away. Then I hoped once more, and all along both banks of the river there was anger among the lost things that anything should dare to hope upon the forsaken mud. Gradually the horrible houses crumbled until the poor dead things that never had had life got decent burial among the weeds and moss. At last the May appeared and the convolvulus. Finally the wild rose stood up over the mounds that had been wharves and warehouses. Then I knew that the cause of nature had triumphed and London had passed away. The last man in London came to the wall by the river in an ancient cloak that was one of those that once my friends had worn, and peered over the edge to see that I was still there. Then he went, and I never saw men again. They had passed away with London. A few days after the last man had gone, the birds came into London, all the birds that sing. When they first saw me, they all looked sideways at me. Then they went away a little and spoke among themselves. "He only sinned against man," they said. "It is not our quarrel. Let us be kind to him," they said. Then they hopped nearer me and began to sing. It was the time of the rising of the dawn, and from both banks of the river, and from the sky, and from the thickets that were once the streets, hundreds of birds were singing. As the light increased, the birds sang more and more. They grew thicker and thicker in the air above my head, till there were thousands of them singing there, and then millions, and at last I could see nothing but a host of flickering wings with the sunlight on them, and little gaps of sky. Then, when there was nothing to be heard in London but the myriad notes of that exultant song, my soul rose up from the bones in the hole in the mud and began to climb heavenwards. And it seemed that a laneway opened amongst the wings of the birds, and it went up, and one of the smaller gates of paradise stood ajar at the end of it. And then I knew by a sign that the mud should receive me no more, for suddenly I found that I could weep. At this moment I opened my eyes in bed in a house in London, and outside some sparrows were twittering in a tree in the light of the radiant morning, and there were tears still wet upon my face, for one's restraint is feeble when one sleeps. But I arose and opened the window wide, and stretching my hands out over the little garden, I blessed the birds whose song had woken me up from the troubled and terrible centuries of my dream. End of Where the Tides Ebb and Flow, Chapter 4 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. Bethmora, Chapter 5 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. There is a faint freshness in the London night, as though some strayed reveller of a breeze had left his comrades in the Kentish uplands and had entered the town by stealth. The pavements are a little damp and shiny. Upon one's ears, that at this late hour have become very acute, there hits the tap of a remote footfall. Louder and louder grow the taps, filling the whole night, and a black-cloaked figure passes by and goes tapping into the dark. One who has danced goes homewards. Somewhere a ball has closed its doors and ended. Its yellow lights are out, its musicians are silent, its dancers have all gone into the night air, and time has said of it, "Let it be past and over, and among the things that I have put away." Shadows begin to detach themselves from their great gathering places. No less silently than those shadows that are thin and dead, move homewards the stealthy cats. Thus have we even in London our faint forebodings of the dawn's approach, which the birds and the beasts and the stars are crying aloud to the untrammeled fields. At what moment, I know not, I perceive that the night itself is irrevocably overthrown. It is suddenly revealed to me, by the weary pallor of the street lamps, that the streets are silent and nocturnal still, not because there's any strength in night, but because men have not yet arisen from sleep to defy him. So have I seen dejected and untidy guards still bearing antique muskets in palatial gateways, although the realms of the monarch that they guard have shrunk to a single province which no enemy has yet troubled to overrun. And it is now manifest from the aspect of the street lamps, those abashed dependents of night, that already English mountain peaks have seen the dawn, that the cliffs of Dover are standing white to the morning, that the sea mist has lifted and is pouring inland. And now men with a hose have come out and are sluicing out the streets. Behold now, night is dead. What memories, what fancies throng one's mind. A night but just now gathered out of London by the horrific hand of time. A million common artificial things all cloaked for a while in mystery, like beggars robed in purple and seated on dread thrones. 4 million people asleep, dreaming perhaps. What worlds have they gone into? Whom have they met? But my thoughts are far off with Bethmora in her loneliness, whose gates swing to and fro. To and fro they swing, and creak in the wind, but no one hears them. They are of green copper, very lovely, but no one sees them now. The desert wind pours sand into their hinges, no watchman comes to ease them. No guard goes round Bethmora's battlements, no enemy assails them. There are no lights in her houses, no footfall on her streets. She stands there, dead and lonely beyond the hills of Hap. And I would see Bethmora once again, but dare not. It is many a year, they tell me, since Bethmora became desolate. Her desolation is spoken of in taverns where sailors meet, and certain travelers have told me of it. I had hoped to see Bethmora once again. It is many a year ago, they say, when the vintage was last gathered in from the vineyards that I knew, where it is all desert now. It was a radiant day, and the people of the city were dancing by the vineyards, while here and there one played upon the calapac. The purple flowering shrubs were all in bloom, and the snow shone upon the hills of Hap. Outside the copper gates they crushed the grapes in vats to make the sirubub. It had been a goodly vintage. In the little gardens at the desert's edge, men beat the tombang and the titibuk and blew melodiously the zoodabar. All there was mirth and song and dance, because the vintage had been gathered in, and there would be ample sirubub for the winter months, and much left over to exchange for turquoises and emeralds with the merchants who come down from Oxuhan. Thus they rejoiced all day over their vintage on the narrow strip of cultivated ground that lay between Bethmora and the desert which meets the sky to the south. And when the heat of the day began to abate, and the sun drew near to the snows on the hills of Hap, the note of the Zudabar still rose clear from the gardens, and the brilliant dresses of the dancers still wound among the flowers. All that day, 3 men on mules had been noticed crossing the face of the hills of Hap. Backwards and forwards they moved as the track wound lower and lower, 3 little specks of black against the snow. They were seen first in the very early morning up near the shoulder of Pale Yaganath, and seemed to be coming out of Utnarvahi. All day they came, and in the evening, just before the lights come out and colors change, they appeared before Bethmora's copper gates. They carried staves, such as messengers bear in those lands, and seemed somberly clad when the dancers all came round them with their green and lilac dresses. Those Europeans who were present and heard the message given were ignorant of the language and only caught the name of Utnarvahi, but it was brief and passed rapidly from mouth to mouth, and almost at once the people burnt their vineyards and began to flee away from Bethmora, going for the most part northwards, though some went to the east. They ran down out of their fair white houses and streamed through the copper gate. The throbbing of the tambang and the titterbuck suddenly ceased with the note of the Zudabar, and the clinking calabac stopped a moment after. The 3 strange travelers went back the way they came the instant their message was given. It was the hour when a light would have appeared in some high tower, and window after window would have poured into the dusk its lion-frightening light, and the copper gates would have been fastened up. But no lights came out in windows there that night, and have not ever since. And those copper gates were left wide and have never shut. And the sound arose of the red fire crackling in the vineyards, and the pattering of feet fleeing softly. There were no cries, no other sounds at all, only the rapid and determined flight. They fled as swiftly and quietly as a herd of wild cattle flee when they suddenly see a man. It was as though something had befallen which had been feared for generations, which could only be escaped by instant flight, which left no time for indecision. Then fear took the Europeans also, and they too fled, and what the message was, I have never heard. Many believe that it was a message from Thubamlin, the mysterious emperor of those lands, who is never seen by man, advising that Bethmora should be left desolate. Others say that the message was one of warning from the gods, whether from friendly gods or from adverse ones they know not. And others hold that the plague was ravaging a line of cities over in Utnarvahi, following the southwest wind which for many weeks had been blowing across them towards Bethmora. Some say that the terrible Nusar sickness was upon the 3 travelers, and that their very mules were dripping with it, and suppose that they were driven to the city by hunger, but suggest no better reason for so terrible a crime. But most believe that it was a message from the desert himself, who owns all the earth to the southwards, spoken with his peculiar cry to those 3 who knew his voice, men who had been out on the sand wastes without tents by night, who had been by day without water, men who had been out there where the desert mutters, and had grown to know his needs and his malevolence. They say that the desert had a need for Bethmora, that he wished to come into her lovely streets, and descend into her temples and her houses, his storm winds draped with sand. For he hates the sound and the sight of men in his old evil heart, and he would have Bethmora silent and undisturbed, save for the weird love he whispers to her gates. If I knew what that message was that the 3 men brought on mules and told in the copper gate, I think that I should go and see Bethmora once again. For a great longing comes on me here in London to see once more that white and beautiful city, and yet I dare not, for I know not the danger I should have to face, whether I should risk the fury of unknown dreadful gods, or some disease unspeakable and slow, or the desert's curse, or a torture in some little private room of the Emperor Thubamlin, or something that the travelers have not told, perhaps more fearful still. End of Beth Mura, Chapter 5 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. Idle Days on the Yann, Chapter 6 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. So I came down through the wood on the bank of Yann, and found, as had been prophesied, the ship Bird of the River about to loose her cable. The captain sat cross-legged upon the white deck, with his scimitar lying beside him in its jeweled scabbard, and the sailors toiled to spread the nimble sails to bring the ship into the central stream of Yann, and all the while sang ancient, soothing songs. And the wind of the evening, descending cool from the snowfields of some mountainous abode of distant gods, came suddenly, like glad tidings to an anxious city, into the wing-like sails. And so we came into the central stream, whereat the sailors lowered the greater sails. But I had gone to bow before the captain, and to inquire concerning the miracles and appearances among men of the most holy gods of whatever land he had come from. And the captain answered that he came from fair Belzund, and worshipped gods that were the least and humblest, who seldom sent the famine or the thunder, and were easily appeased with little battles. And I told how I came from Ireland, which is of Europe, whereat the captain and all the sailors laughed, for they said, "There are no such places in all the land of dreams." When they had ceased to mock me, I explained that my fancy mostly dwelt in the desert of Cuparnambo, about a beautiful blue city called Galthoth the Dam, which was sentineled all round by wolves and their shadows, and had been utterly desolate for years and years, because of a curse which the gods once spoke in anger and could never since recall. And sometimes my dreams took me as far as Pungarvis, the red-walled city where the fountains are, which trades with the Isles and Thule. When I said this, they complimented me upon the abode of my fancy, saying that, though they had never seen these cities, such places might well be imagined. For the rest of that evening I bargained with the captain over the sum that I should pay him for any fare if God and the tide of Yann should bring us safely as far as the cliffs by the sea, which are named Barawul Yann, the Gate of Yann. And now the sun had set, and all the colors of the world and heaven had held a festival with him, and slipped one by one away from the imminent approach of night. The parrots had all flown home to the jungle on either bank, for monkeys in rows in safety on high branches of the trees were silent and asleep. The fireflies in the deeps of the forest were going up and down, and the great stars came gleaming out to look on the face of Yann. Then the sailors lighted lanterns and hung them round the ship, and the light flashed out on a sudden and dazzled Yann, and the ducks that fed along his marshy banks all suddenly arose and made wide circles in the upper air, and saw the distant reaches of the Yann and the white mist that softly cloaked the jungle before they returned again to their marshes. And then the sailors knelt on the decks and prayed, not all together, but 5 or 6 at a time. Side by side there kneeled down together 5 or 6, for there only prayed at the same time men of different faiths, so that no god should hear 2 men praying to him at once. As soon as anyone had finished his prayer, another of the same faith would take his place. Thus knelt the row of 5 or 6 with bended heads under the fluttering sail, while the central stream of the river Yann took them on towards the sea, and their prayers rose up from among the lanterns and went towards the stars. And behind them in the after end of the ship, the helmsman prayed aloud the helmsman's prayer, which is prayed by all who follow his trade upon the river Yann, of whatever faith they be. And the captain prayed to his little lesser gods, to the gods that bless Belzund. And I too felt that I would pray. Yet I liked not to pray to a jealous god there, where the frail affectionate gods, whom the heathen love, were being humbly invoked. So I bethought me instead of Sheol Nuganoth, whom the men of the jungle have long since deserted, who is now unworshipped and alone, and to him I prayed. And upon us praying, the night came suddenly down, as it comes upon all men who pray at evening, and upon all men who do not. Yet our prayers comforted our own souls when we thought of the great night to come. And so Jan bore us magnificently onwards, for he was elate with molten snow that the Poltiades had brought him from the hills of Hap, and the Marne and Migris were swollen with floods. And he bore us in his full might past Keef and Pier, and we saw the lights of Gulunza. Soon we all slept except the helmsman, who kept the ship in the midstream of Yann. When the sun rose, the helmsman ceased to sing, for by song he cheered himself in the lonely night. When the song ceased, we suddenly all awoke, and another took the helm, and the helmsman slept. We knew that soon we should come to Mandaroon. We made a meal, and Mandaroon appeared. Then the captain commanded, and the sailors loosed again the greater sails, and the ship turned left and left the stream of Yann, and came into a harbor beneath the ruddy walls of Mandaroon. Then, while the sailors went and gathered fruits, I came alone to the gate of Mandaroon. A few huts were outside it, in which lived the guard. A sentinel with a long white beard was standing in the gate, armed with a rusty pike. He wore large spectacles, which were covered with dust. Through the gate I saw the city. A deathly stillness was over all of it. The ways seemed untrodden, and moss was thick on doorsteps. In the marketplace, huddled figures lay asleep. A scent of incense came wafted through the gateway, of incense and burned poppies, and there was a hum of the echoes of distant bells. I said to the sentinel in the tongue of the region of Yann, "Why are they all asleep in this still city?" He answered, "None may ask questions in this gate, for fear they will wake the people of the city. For when the people of the city wake, the gods will die, and when the gods die, men may dream no more." And I began to ask him what gods that city worshipped, but he lifted his pike, because none may ask questions there. So I left him, and went back to the Bird of the River. Certainly Mandaroon was beautiful, with her white pinnacles peering over her ruddy walls and the green of her copper roofs. When I came back again to the Bird of the River, I found the sailors were returned to the ship. Soon we weighed anchor and sailed out again, and so came once more to the middle of the river. And now the sun was moving toward his heights, and there had reached us on the river Yann the song of those countless myriads of choirs that attended him in his progress round the world. For the little creatures that have many legs had spread their gauze wings easily on the air, as a man rests his elbows on a balcony, and gave jubilant ceremonial praises to the sun, or else they moved together on the air in wavering dances intricate and swift, or turned aside to avoid the onrush of some drop of water that a breeze had shaken from a jungle orchid, chilling the air and driving it before it, as it fell whirring in its rush to the earth. But all the while they sang triumphantly. "For the day is for us," they said, "whether our great and sacred father the sun shall bring up more life like us from the marshes, or whether all the world shall end tonight." And there sang all those whose notes are known to human ears, as well as those whose far more numerous notes have never been heard by man. To these a rainy day had been as an era of war that should desolate continents during all the lifetime of a man. And there came out also from the dark and steaming jungle to behold and rejoice in the sun the huge and lazy butterflies. And they danced, but danced idly on the ways of the air, as some haughty queen of distant conquered lands might in her poverty and exile dance, in some encampment of the gypsies for the mere bread to live by, but beyond that would never abate her pride to dance for a fragment more. And the butterflies sung of strange and painted things, of purple orchids and of lost pink cities and the monstrous colors of the jungle's decay. And they too were among those whose voices are not discernible by human ears. And as they floated above the river, going from forest to forest, their splendor was matched by the inimical beauty of the birds who darted out to pursue them. Or sometimes they settled on the white and wax-like blooms of the plant that creeps and clambers about the trees of the forest, and their purple wings flashed out on the great blossoms as, when the caravans go from Nurl to Thace, the gleaming silks flash out upon the snow, where the crafty merchants spread them one by one to astonish the mountaineers of the hills of Nur. But upon men and beasts the sun sent drowsiness. The river monsters along the river's marge lay dormant in the slime. The sailors pitched a pavilion with golden tassels for the captain upon the deck, and then went, all but the helmsman, under a sail that they had hung as an awning between two masts. Then they told tales to one another, each of his own city or of the miracles of his god, until all were fallen asleep. The captain offered me the shade of his pavilion with the gold tassels, and there we talked for a while, he telling me that he was taking merchandise to Blagdaross, and that he would take back to fair Belzoond things appertaining to the affairs of the sea. Then, as I watched through the pavilion's opening the brilliant birds and butterflies that crossed and recrossed over the river, I fell asleep, and dreamed that I was a monarch entering his capital underneath arches of flags, and all the musicians of the world were there, playing melodiously their instruments, but no one cheered. In the afternoon, as the day grew cooler again, I awoke and found the captain buckling on his scimitar, which he had taken off him while he rested. And now we were approaching the wide court of Astahan, which opens upon the river. Strange boats of antique design were chained there to the steps. As we neared it, we saw the open marble court, on three sides of which stood the city fronting on colonnades. And in the court and along the colonnades the people of that city walked with solemnity and care, according to the rites of ancient ceremony. All in that city was of ancient device. The carving on the houses, which, when age had broken it, remained unrepaired, was of the remotest times, and everywhere were represented in stone beasts that have long since passed away from earth, the dragon, the griffin, the hippogriffin, and the different species of gargoyle. Nothing was to be found, whether material or custom, that was new in Astahan. Now they took no notice at all of us as we went by, but continued their processions and ceremonies in the ancient city, and the sailors, knowing their custom, took no notice of them. But I called, as we came near, to one who stood beside the water's edge, asking him what men did in Astahan and what their merchandise was, and with whom they traded. He said, "Here we have fettered and manacled Time, who would otherwise slay the gods." I asked him what gods they worshipped in that city, and he said, "All those gods whom Time has not yet slain." Then he turned from me and would say no more, but busied himself in behaving in accordance with ancient custom. And so, according to the will of Jan, we drifted onwards and left Astahan. The river widened below Astahan, and we found in greater quantities such birds as prey on fishes. And they were very wonderful in their plumage, and they came not out of the jungle, but flew with their long necks stretched out before them, and their legs lying on the wind behind, straight up the river over the midstream. And now the evening began to gather in. A thick white mist had appeared over the river, and was softly rising higher. It clutched at the trees with long, impalpable arms. It rose higher and higher, chilling the air, and white shapes moved away into the jungle as though the ghosts of shipwrecked mariners were searching stealthily in the darkness for the spirits of evil that long ago had wrecked them on the Yan. As the sun sank behind the field of orchids that grew on the matted summit of the jungle, the river monsters came wallowing out of the slime in which they had reclined during the heat of the day, and the great beasts of the jungle came down to drink. The butterflies a while since were gone to rest. In little narrow tributaries that we passed, night seemed already to have fallen, though the sun which had disappeared from us had not yet set. And now the birds of the jungle came flying home far over us, with the sunlight glistening pink upon their breasts, and lowered their pinions as soon as they saw the Yan, and dropped into the trees. and the widgeon began to go up the river in great companies, all whistling, and then would suddenly wheel and all go down again. And there shot by us the small and arrow-like teal, and we heard the manifold cries of flocks of geese, which the sailors told me had recently come in from crossing over the Vespasian ranges. Every year they come by the same way, close by the peak of Luna, leaving it to the left, and the mountain eagles know the way they come and, men say, the very hour, and every year they expect them by the same way as soon as the snows have fallen upon the northern plains. But soon it grew so dark that we heard those birds no more, and only heard the whirring of their wings, and of countless others besides, until they all settled down along the banks of the river, and it was the hour when the birds of the night went forth. Then the sailors lit the lanterns for the night, and huge moths appeared, flapping about the ship, and at moments their gorgeous colors would be revealed by the lanterns. Then they would pass into the night again, where all was black. And again the sailors prayed, and thereafter we supped and slept, and the helmsman took our lives into his care. When I awoke, I found that we had indeed come to Blagdaross, that famous city, for there it stood upon the left of us, a city fair and notable, and all the more pleasant for our eyes to see after the jungle that was so long with us. And we were anchored by the marketplace, and the captain's merchandise was all displayed, and a merchant of Blagdaross stood looking at it. And the captain had his scimitar in his hand, and was beating with it in anger upon the deck, and the splinters were flying up from the white planks, for the merchant had offered him a price for his merchandise that the captain declared to be an insult to himself and his country's gods, whom he now said to be great and terrible gods, whose curses were to be dreaded. But the merchant waved his hands, which were of great fatness, showing the pink palms, and swore that of himself he thought not at all, but only of the poor folk in the huts beyond the city, to whom he wished to sell the merchandise for as low a price as possible, leaving no remuneration for himself. For the merchandise was mostly the thick tamarind carpets that in the winter keep the wind from the floor, and toleb, which the people smoke in pipes. Therefore the merchant said if he offered a piffek more, the poor folk must go without their tamarinds when the winter came, and without their toleb in the evenings, or else he and his aged father must starve together. Thereat the captain lifted his scimitar to his own throat, saying that he was now a ruined man, and that nothing remained to him but death. And while he was carefully lifting his beard with his left hand, the merchant eyed the merchandise again, and said that rather than see so worthy a captain die, a man for whom he had conceived an especial love when he first saw the manner in which he handled his ship, he and his aged father should starve together, and therefore he offered 15 piffeks more. When he said this, the captain prostrated himself, and prayed to his gods that they might yet sweeten this merchant's bitter heart, to his little lesser gods, to the gods that bless Belzund. At last the merchant offered yet 5 piffeks more. Then the captain wept, for he said that he was deserted of his gods, and the merchant also wept, for he said that he was thinking of his aged father, and of how he soon would starve, and he hid his weeping face with both his hands, and eyed the toleb again between his fingers. And so the bargain was concluded, and the merchant took the tamarind and toleb, paying for them out of a great clinking purse, and these were packed up into bales again, and 3 of the merchant's slaves carried them upon their heads into the city. And all the while the sailors had sat silent, cross-legged in a crescent upon the deck, eagerly watching the bargain, and now a murmur of satisfaction arose among them, and they began to compare it among themselves with other bargains that they had known. And I found out from them that there are 7 merchants in Blagdaross, and that they had all come to the captain one by one before the bargaining began, and each had warned him privately against the others. And to all the merchants the captain had offered the wine of his country that they make in fair Belzund, but could in no wise persuade them to it. But now that the bargain was over, and the sailors were seated at the first meal of the day, the captain appeared among them with a cask of that wine, and we broached it with care, and all made merry together. and the captain was glad in his heart, because he knew that he had much honor in the eyes of his men because of the bargain that he had made. So the sailors drank the wine of their native land, and soon their thoughts were back in fair Belzoond and the little neighboring cities of Durrell and Duz. But for me, the captain poured into a little jar some heavy yellow wine from a small jar which he kept apart from his sacred things. Thick and sweet it was, even like honey, yet there was in its heart a mighty ardent fire which had authority over souls of men. It was made, the captain told me, with great subtlety by the secret craft of a family of 6 who lived in a hut on the mountains of Hian Min. Once in these mountains, he said, he followed the spoor of a bear, and he came suddenly on a man of that family who had hunted the same bear, and he was at the end of a narrow way with precipice all about him, and his spear was sticking in the bear, and the wound was not fatal, and he had no other weapon. And the bear was walking towards the man very slowly because his wound irked him, yet he was now very close. And what the captain did he would not say, but every year, as soon as the snows are hard and traveling is easy on the Hian Min, that man comes down to the market in the plains and always leaves for the captain and the gate of fair Belzoond a vessel of that priceless secret wine. And as I sipped the wine and the captain talked, I remembered me of stalwart noble things that I had long since resolutely planned, and my soul seemed to grow mightier within me and to dominate the whole tide of the Yan. It may be that I then slept, or if I did not, I do not now minutely recollect every detail of that morning's occupations. Towards evening I awoke, and wishing to see Perdondaris before we left in the morning, and being unable to wake the captain, I went ashore alone. Certainly Perdondaris was a powerful city. It was encompassed by a wall of great strength and altitude, having in it hollow ways for troops to walk in, and battlements along it all the way, and 15 strong towers on it in every mile, and copper plaques low down where men could read them, telling in all the languages of those parts of the earth, one language on each plaque, the tale of how an army once attacked Perdondaris and what befell that army. Then I entered Perdondaris and found all the people dancing, clad in brilliant silks, and playing on the tambang as they danced. For a fearful thunderstorm had terrified them while I slept, and the fires of death, they said, had danced over Perdondaris. And now the thunder had gone, leaping away large and black and hideous, they said, over the distant hills, and had turned round snarling at them, showing his gleaming teeth, and had stamped as he went upon the hilltops until they rang as though they had been bronze. And often and again they stopped in their merry dances and prayed to the God they knew not, saying, O God that we know not, we thank thee for sending the thunder back to his hills. And I went on and came to the marketplace, and lying there upon the marble pavement, I saw the merchant fast asleep and breathing heavily, with his face in the palms of his hands toward the sky, and slaves were fanning him to keep away the flies. And from the marketplace I came to a silver temple, and then to a palace of onyx, and there were many wonders in Perdondaris, and I would have stayed and seen them all, but as I came to the outer wall of the city, I suddenly saw in it a huge ivory gate. For a while I paused and admired it. Then I came nearer and perceived the dreadful truth. The gate was carved out of one solid piece. I fled at once through the gateway and down to the ship, and even as I ran I thought that I heard far off on the hills behind me the tramp of the fearful beast by whom that mass of ivory was shed, who was perhaps even then looking for his other tusk. When I was on the ship again I felt safer, and I said nothing to the sailors of what I had seen. And now the captain was gradually awakening. Now night was rolling up from the east and north, and only the pinnacles of the towers of Perdondaris still took the fallen sunlight. Then I went to the captain and told him quietly of the thing I had seen. And he questioned me at once about the gate in a low voice, that the sailors might not know. And I told him how the weight of the thing was such that it could not have been brought from afar, and the captain knew that it had not been there a year ago. We agreed that such a beast could never have been killed by any assault of man, and that the gate must have been a fallen tusk, and one fallen near and recently. Therefore he decided that it were better to flee at once. So he commanded, and the sailors went to the sails, and others raised the anchor to the deck, and just as the highest pinnacle of marble lost the last rays of the sun, we left Blagdaross, that famous city. And night came down, and cloaked Blagdaross, and hid it from our eyes, which, as things have happened, will never see it again. For I have heard since that something swift and wonderful has suddenly wrecked Blagdaross in a day, towers, walls, and people. And the night deepened over the river Yon, a night all white with stars. And with the night there rose the helmsman's song. As soon as he had prayed, he began to sing to cheer himself all through the lonely night. But first he prayed, praying the helmsman's prayer. And this is what I remember of it, rendered into English with a very feeble equivalent of the rhythm that seemed so resonant in those tropic nights. To whatever God may hear, wherever there be sailors, whether of river or sea, whether their way be dark or whether through storm, whether their peril be of beast or of rock, or from enemy lurking on land or pursuing on sea, wherever the tiller is cold or the helmsman stiff, wherever sailors sleep or helmsmen watch, guard, guide, and return us to the old land that has known us, to the far homes that we know, to all the gods that are, to whatever God may hear. So he prayed, and there was silence, and the sailors laid them down to rest for the night. The silence deepened, and was only broken by the ripples of Yon that lightly touched our prow. Sometimes some monster of the river coughed. Silence and ripples, ripples and silence again. And then his loneliness came upon the helmsman, and he began to sing. And he sang the market songs of Durrell and Dews, and the old dragon legends of Belzund. Many a song he sang, telling to spacious and exotic Yon the little tales and trifles of his city of Durrell. And the songs welled up over the black jungle and came into the clear, cold air above, and the great bands of stars that look on Yon began to know the affairs of Durrell and Dews, and of the shepherds that dwelt in the fields between, and the flocks that they had, and the loves that they had loved, and all the little things that they had hoped to do. And as I lay wrapped up in skins and blankets, listening to those songs, and watching the fantastic shapes of the great trees, like to black giants stalking through the night, I suddenly fell asleep. When I awoke, great mists were trailing away from the Yon, and the flow of the river was tumbling now tumultuously, and little waves appeared, for Yon had scented from afar the ancient crags of Glorm, and knew that their ravines lay cool before him, wherein he should meet the merry wild Aurelian, rejoicing from fields of snow. So he shook off from him the torpid sleep that had come upon him in the hot and scented jungle, and forgot its orchids and its butterflies, and swept on, turbulent, expectant, strong, and soon the snowy peaks of the hills of Glorm came glittering into view. And now the sailors were waking up from sleep. Soon we all ate, and then the helmsman laid him down to sleep, while a comrade took his place, and they all spread over him their choicest furs. And in a while we heard the sound that the Aurelian made as she came down dancing from the fields of snow. And then we saw the ravine in the hills of Glorm lying precipitous and smooth before us, into which we were carried by the leaps of Yon. And now we left the steamy jungle and breathed the mountain air. The sailors stood up and took deep breaths of it, and thought of their own far-off Acroctian hills on which were Durrell and Dews. Below them in the plains stands fair Belzund. A great shadow brooded between the cliffs of Glorm, but the crags were shining above us like gnarled moons, and almost lit the gloom. Louder and louder came the Aurelian's song, and the sound of her dancing down from the fields of snow. And soon we saw her white and full of mists, and wreathed with rainbows delicate and small that she had plucked up near the mountain's summit from some celestial garden of the sun. Then she went away seawards with a huge grey yawn, and the ravine widened and opened upon the world, and our rocking ship came through to the light of the day. And all that morning and all the afternoon we passed through the marshes of Pondoovery, and Jan widened there and flowed solemnly and slowly, and the captain bade the sailors beat on bells to overcome the dreariness of the marshes. At last the Erusian mountains came in sight, nursing the villages of Penkai and Blut, and the wandering streets of Mlo, where priests propitiate the avalanche with wine and maize. Then night came down over the plains of Tlun, and we saw the lights of Cappadarnia. We heard the path knights beating upon drums as we passed Dimout and Golzunda. Then all but the helmsmen slept. And villages scattered along the banks of the Jan heard all that night in the helmsman's unknown tongue the little songs of cities that they knew not. I awoke before dawn with a feeling that I was unhappy before I remembered why. Then I recalled that by the evening of the approaching day, according to all foreseen probabilities, we should come to Bar Wul Yan, and I should part from the captain and his sailors. And I had liked the man because he had given me of his yellow wine that was set apart among his sacred things, and many a story he had told me about his fair Belzoond between the Acrocian hills and the Yan Min. And I had liked the ways that his sailors had, and the prayers that they prayed at evening side by side, grudging not one another their alien gods. And I had a liking too for the tender way in which they often spoke of Dural and Duz, for it is good that men should love their native cities and the little hills that hold those cities up. And I had come to know who would meet them when they returned to their homes, and where they thought the meetings would take place. Some in a valley of the Acrocian hills where the road comes up from Yan, others in the gateway of one or another of the 3 cities, and others by the fireside in the home. And I thought of the danger that had menaced us all alike outside Blagdaross, a danger that, as things have happened, was very real. And I thought, too, of the helmsman's cheery song in the cold and lonely night, and how he had held our lives in his careful hands. And as I thought of this, the helmsman ceased to sing, and I looked up and saw a pale light had appeared in the sky, and the lonely night had passed, and the dawn widened, and the sailors awoke. And soon we saw the tide of the sea himself advancing resolute between Jan's borders, and Jan sprang lithely at him, and they struggled a while. Then Jan and all that was his were pushed back northward, so that the sailors had to hoist the sails, and, the wind being favorable, we still held onwards. And we passed Gundara and Gnarl and Haz, and we saw memorable holy Galnus, and heard the pilgrims praying. When we awoke after the midday rest, we were coming near to Nen, the last of the cities on the river Yan, and the jungle was all about us once again, and about Nen, but the great Mloon ranges stood up over all things, and watched the city from beyond the jungle. Here we anchored, and the captain and I went up into the city and found that the Wanderers had come into Nen. And the Wanderers were a weird, dark tribe that once in every 7 years came down from the peaks of Mloon, having crossed by a pass that is known to them from some fantastic land that lies beyond. And the people of Nen were all outside their houses, and all stood wondering at their own streets, for the men and women of the Wanderers had crowded all the ways, and every one was doing some strange thing. Some danced astounding dances that they had learned from the desert wind, rapidly curving and swirling till the eye could follow no longer. Others played upon instruments beautiful, wailing tunes that were full of horror, which souls had taught them lost by night in the desert, that strange, far desert from which the Wanderers came. None of their instruments were such as were known in Nen, nor in any part of the region of the Yan. Even the horns out of which some were made were of beasts that none had seen along the river, for they were barbed at the tips. And they sang, in the language of none, songs that seemed to be akin to the mysteries of night and to the unreasoned fear that haunts dark places. Bitterly all the dogs of Nen distrusted them. And the wanderers told one another fearful tales, for though no one in Nen knew aught of their language, yet they could see the fear on the listeners' faces, and as the tale wound on, the whites of their eyes showed vividly in terror, as the eyes of some little beast whom the hawk has seized. Then the teller of the tale would smile and stop, and another would tell his story, and the teller of the first tale's lips would chatter with fear. And if some deadly snake chanced to appear, the wanderers would greet him as a brother, and the snake would seem to give his greetings to them before he passed on again. Once that most fierce and lethal of tropic snakes, the giant Lithra, came out of the jungle and all down the street, the central street of Nen, and none of the wanderers moved away from him, but they all played sonorously on drums as though he had been a person of much honor, and the snake moved through the midst of them and smote none. Even the wanderers' children could do strange things, for if any one of them met with a child of Nen, the two would stare at each other in silence with large grave eyes. Then the wanderer's child would slowly draw from his turban a live fish or snake, and the children of Nen could do nothing of that kind at all. Much I should have wished to stay and hear the hymn with which they greet the night that is answered by the wolves on the heights of Mloon. But it was now time to raise the anchor again, that the captain might return from Bar Wul Yan upon the landward tide. So we went on board and continued down the Yan. And the captain and I spoke little, for we were thinking of our parting, which should be for long, and we watched instead the splendor of the westerning sun. For the sun was a ruddy gold, but a faint mist cloaked the jungle lying low, and into it poured the smoke of the little jungle cities, and the smoke of them met together in the mist and joined into one haze, which became purple and was lit by the sun as the thoughts of men become hallowed by some great and sacred thing. Sometimes one column from a lonely house would rise up higher than the city's smoke and gleam by itself in the sun. And now, as the sun's last rays were nearly level, we saw the sight that I had come to see, for from two mountains that stood on either shore, two cliffs of pink marble came out into the river, all glowing in the light of the low sun, and they were quite smooth and of mountainous altitude, and they nearly met, and Yan went tumbling between them and found the sea. And this was Bar Wul Yan, the gate of Yan. And in the distance through that barrier's gap I saw the azure, indescribable sea, where little fishing boats went gleaming by. And the sun set, and the brief twilight came, and the exultation of the glory of Bar Wul Yan was gone. Yet still the pink cliffs glowed, the fairest marvel that the eye beheld, and this in a land of wonders. And soon the twilight gave place to the coming out of stars, and the colors of Bar Wul Yan went dwindling away. And the sight of those cliffs was to me as some chord of music that a master's hand had launched from the violin, and which carries to heaven or fairy the tremulous spirits of men. And now by the shore they anchored and went no further, for they were sailors of the river and not of the sea, and knew the Yan but not the tides beyond. And the time was come when the captain and I must part, he to go back to his fair Belzund in sight of the distant peaks of the Hian Min, and I to find my way by strange means back to those hazy fields that all poets know, wherein stand small mysterious cottages through whose windows, looking westwards, you may see the fields of men, and looking eastwards see glittering elfin mountains tipped with snow, going range on range into the region of myth, and beyond it into the kingdom of fantasy, which pertain to the lands of dream. Long we regarded one another, knowing that we should meet no more, for my fancy is weakening as the years slip by, and I go ever more seldom into the lands of dream. Then we clasped hands uncouthly on his part, for it is not the method of greeting in his country, and he commended my soul to the care of his own gods, to his little lesser gods, the humble ones, to the gods that bless Belzund. End of Idle Days on the Yacht. Chapter 6 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany.